Well, thank you all for inviting me. It's nice to be here with this group, and we'll get my slides up. Amy has highlighted an important issue, and that is the issue of the difference between the farm family's children and hired children. And I'll talk more about that because that's the perspective I come from, is the hired side. Makes my job a little easier than some of the other associations that are here that have the whole spectrum. So NCAE is National Trade Association for Labor-Intensive Agriculture. Our members are growers, fruits, vegetables, nursery, dairy. The common denominator is labor-intensive, and a lot of associations, including some really big associations, are our members. And again, the common denominator there is those associations members are generally labor-intensive agriculture. One of our difficulties with the whole safety discussion overall and particularly for children is, if you see most of the literature that you see for this organization, for ASHCA, which I'm on the board for, is very, very row crop centric. And that is the easy part because that's the family farm part. The difference between, and I guess we can go to the next slide, because it's so difficult not to have mixed messages. The difference between our children and hired children. And so it gets mixed up sometimes in the media. Amy's talking predominantly here about the children of hired workers and in some cases hired children, which is, I'll talk about that, isn't that common a thing, but it's common enough that it happens. Interestingly, when Christy was talking, all I could think of was, you know, I see Christy almost once a week in DC on a really easy issue called immigration, and Amy reminded me of that too. And yet we worked on this issue, and it gives me a chance to thank Christy and Farm Bureau particularly for having taken leadership on that very, very difficult issue on the DOL proposal, because nobody else could have taken that leadership. And nobody wanted to, but all of us kind of glommed together and worked with Farm Bureau and got the language right, because everybody wanted safety. That was the common enough. Everybody wanted children to be safe, but it's got to be done properly so that it doesn't harm families, the future of farming. It doesn't stop FFA and 4-H and groups like that from being able to train people, and it doesn't discourage everybody young for going into farming, because if you look at farming groups, I'm still one of the young guys in most of those groups. Not a lot of us are going to be around. We need all of these guys to take over soon. So anyway, go to the next slide. We want and need clear parental rights. My members all want this. The dilemma for them, they're almost all family farmers. Some of them are very big family farmers. Big family farms growing tens of thousands of acres of vegetables and fruits and dairy. But they want parental rights because it's their children they're talking about and their farm futures. But next, but commercial growers, I'm talking about commercial scale growers who grow most of the food for our country and for the world, the food we eat, not corn and soybeans. That's a different kind of growing. 2 or 3, 4 people can manage thousands of acres. 200 acre or so of blueberries takes hundreds of people. And commercial growers neither want nor need child labor. It's a question I'm asked all the time. The press always loves to ask us, well, Mr. Gasperini, your farmers, don't they really need, Byron Pitts says, don't they really need all these children working for them? They couldn't make their crop without the children. This little girl isn't going to make minimum wage. And she's got to be paid minimum wage if you're going to hire her legally. She's not old enough. We don't want that. Children end up in the field because there's not child care for them. There's no place for them to go. The family brings them to the field. They may or may not intend for them to work. Some families need the money, and they'll have that couple buckets might mean a few more cents. If the kid's in the field, they're going to do what mom and dad do, and they're going to pick something. And as soon as they do, our wage and hour representative tell you, that child picks 3 blueberries, puts them in mom's bucket. She's my employee, even if I don't know she's in the field. So the next slide. So I'm saying, this children this young in the field represent a breakdown. There's not many growers that do it intentionally. There probably are some. I don't think they're commercial big growers that are growing our food that do this intentionally. I do think it, in some cases, represents a failure of the government, because responsible growers don't want to see this. Children working as hired workers is not economically or morally sustainable. We do need and want commercial. We just don't need these kids working in the field. Next. Now, even with our own children, and I think Yeah, that's one. And go to the next one, too. This is where Christy was getting. Even with our own children, it might be legal, but just because it's legal doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing to do. And the one issue that's very important here, incidents happen. And I ask people, I ask my own members, they say, you know, I was driving a combine when I was 8 years old, or I was driving, you know, the wagon for the melon pickers to throw the melons in when I was 8, and I had a whole crew out there working, picking. You got to ask yourself, if you're 8-year-old or you're 10-year-old, very competent, why is it that they're not allowed to drive a car on the road? They might be able to do that pretty good, but they're not allowed to, and there are some reasons for that. If this happens with an adult, it's a terrible, terrible tragedy, and somebody might die, the driver or an employee or a bystander. It's a terrible tragedy. There's a cost to that. If your 10-year-old's driving the tractor, even if you thought competent, how well do you think you would fare when the person who's maimed or killed's family hires a good lawyer to take you into court? And you have to explain, well, the 10-year-old was perfectly competent to drive that tractor. That wasn't negligence that allowed this to happen. I think this loses family farms. And I'm surprised. I know that there are cases where family farms have been lost because of accidents. And it's really hard. Next. So it gets really difficult for us to send clear messages. My job is way easier than a lot of the other associations that I work with. I said a lot of my members are associations. And if you have the whole spectrum, everything from grain to soup to nuts, quite literally, you have to represent everybody. My job is a lot narrower. It's much easier for me because it's all about employment and labor and employers and workers. And so we just basically say some pretty blunt things in our group that most other groups can't get away with. Next. The whole issue of youth farm work, it's emotional, it can be divisive. Commercial growers are also family farms. Because the potential for legal, insurance, food safety issues is going to actually help us with this issue. The new food safety laws are causing people to post and very strictly enforce no non-employees in the workplace, period. The little child, the baby in the milking parlor, there's no way that's going to pass a food safety law. Who's going to change that diaper? You know who's going to change the diaper. It's not going to work under food safety. So the whole issue of kids in the workplace is becoming easier for employers to say no to because the bigger growers, they have very strict food safety laws, and they're fixing to get a whole lot stricter and a lot more enforced. So next. So we recognize with youth working, we do think it's important for youth to be able to work and to learn farming. But it has to be age-appropriate work, the right thing for them to do, and they have to be treated differently. They have different physical, educational, and development needs than an adult. Youth require a different kind of supervision. We've worked like crazy trying to do a set of basic principles. We can't get everybody on my board to agree to them, so we've kind of shared them around with some people, and some other people have made good use of them. But we think, among other things, you need to supervise youth differently than you supervise adults. They're not experienced. There are all kinds of things. In parts of the West, they harvest vegetables on overnight shifts. We don't think youth ought to be allowed to work on an overnight shift, 14-year-olds. It's just not safe for all kinds of reasons. And some of them have to do with machinery. Youth working in agriculture just continues, but if we can't address it, if we, this group, our members, the growers out there, don't address this issue positively, I guarantee that eventually government and Walmart and people like that will do it. And I also guarantee that those of us in this room, most of us aren't going to like the results very much. I keep telling my members this. We either do this ourselves and move the needle on the safety issue and move those statistics so there aren't as many people, young people, old people, the whole ag safety issue, we need to move the needle substantially, or we will see more and more regulation, and we won't like it all. We can do it ourselves or let somebody do it. Next. So I've been trying to say that here are the things we can support. Instead of arguing about what it is we don't like, we hate this, we hate that, and we're going to get criticized in that in agriculture. So I try to talk about some of the things that we can stand for. We do stand for and want career-oriented job training for youth that includes age-appropriate work opportunities, and that grows as the youth grow. Research and education in youth safety and career development programs. We want age-appropriate work for pay opportunities to be out there. We don't really like the idea of just saying, if you're not 18, you can't work on a farm. Where's the next generation of farmers going to come from if we do that? How will you learn to love agriculture if you're not allowed to be exposed to it? Almost all of us that love agriculture and have spent our careers in it, even if we, like me, didn't grow up on a working farm, worked on farms at a very young age, said, this is pretty cool, want to live this way. We need a balance between training, education, and work hours based on age to protect minors and employers. Next. We think it's important for employers to have the right to hire youth who meet the federal and state requirements for age-appropriate work. We also think it's important that employers ought to have the ability to set age limits. If an employer says, I don't want to hire anybody under 18, they ought not to have to worry about being sued and dragged into a discrimination suit by the very same group who complained and said, you're hiring kids too young. And then later, when you say, we're not going to let anybody come pick blueberries unless they're 16 or 18, oh, that's age discrimination in this state, because the age discrimination law goes to both sides. I mean, that's pretty hard. If you don't want to hire youth, you shouldn't have to. If you want to, there should be ways to be allowed to do it. The rights of employers to implement and enforce no non-employees in the workplace or on premises policies is very important. Food safety is going to help with that. But every employer that does this has to be willing to let go their best worker if they violate the policy. You've got to enforce things fairly and evenly and not make lots of exceptions. They're just not going to work. And at the same time, we very much object to the infringement of parental rights on your own operations. We think that's important. Next. We'd like to work more on best practices, and we will work on them again, even though I couldn't get anywhere. We want to continue this dialogue with this community, with other associations out there, bigger and smaller ones, with those who very often see us as adversaries because they represent farm workers. Guess what? We don't have farms. We don't get to produce this food in these labor-intensive works without farm workers. They're not our adversaries. They're our partners. We expect allegations of widespread inappropriate child labor by government or the media to be backed up with factual and current evidence. If this is out there in such huge numbers, then start arresting people and doing some prosecutions, or don't make these allegations. Because I don't think there's that much. I think the people that are doing this should be caught and punished, preferably put out of business, because 99% of American farmers are doing their very best to obey the law, and with a little help will not only obey the letter of the law, but absolutely the spirit of the law and safety. American agriculture is not and has no interest in being dependent on child labor. Agriculture has to work together. We've learned this in the whole immigration debate. What a 2 years up and down. If we can do this with this issue, that with this issue, it's good. But we cannot ever put ourselves in this situation. Agriculture does this to ourselves again and again. Oh no, that's your segment that does that. You guys ought to be punished and make rules for you. No, that's you. If agriculture forms the circular firing squad, there's not enough of us around to defend ourselves in the U.S. and to produce the food and fiber and ornamental crops that the world needs. And they need American agriculture, and we need to be part of American agriculture. Thank you.